At 57, Robert thought he had it all: success in his law career, a loving wife, and 2 kids. But a college reunion and an unexpected confession from his wife, Lucy, changed everything. What happens when the life you've built is shattered by the one person you trusted most? Watch as Robert confronts heartbreak, betrayal, and the painful journey toward healing. Robert had always prided himself on being the steady force in his family's life. At 57, he had built a successful career as a lawyer, well respected in his field. He had earned every bit of the stability his family enjoyed, from the sprawling home they lived in to the college funds he'd saved for Emily and Jack, his 2 children. Lucy, his wife of 30 years, was his confidante, his equal. At 55, she was still as beautiful as when they met in college, with a calming presence that complemented his often intense nature. Lucy was a respected therapist, helping others navigate their emotional struggles, which gave her a unique insight into their own relationship. Together, they'd navigated the usual ups and downs of life-career challenges, the pressures of raising children, and the natural shifts that come with the passing years. But through it all, their marriage had always felt strong. Robert trusted Lucy implicitly. She was the woman he'd married, the woman who had stood beside him through thick and thin, and they had built a life together that seemed unshakable. Their connection felt genuine, founded on years of shared experiences and mutual respect. Despite the challenges they had faced, Robert never doubted Lucy's loyalty. She was the heart of their family, and he had no reason to question her faithfulness. He couldn't imagine a life without her, and in his mind their bond was built to last. But little did he know, something was about to shatter that trust forever, something he would never see coming. When Robert and Lucy decided to attend their college reunion, they both expected a fun and nostalgic weekend. It was an opportunity to reconnect with old friends, relive some of their best memories, and briefly escape the responsibilities of their everyday lives. Lucy was especially looking forward to it, mentioning Rick, a man from their college days, several times in the weeks leading up to the event. Robert didn't think much of it at first. He had heard stories about the old college gang, but Rick wasn't someone Robert remembered particularly well. He assumed it would be a casual reunion and thought little of the way Lucy spoke about him. However, from the moment they arrived, things felt different. The reunion was a sea of familiar faces, but there was an undercurrent of tension that Robert couldn't shake. As soon as Rick arrived, Robert felt an immediate sense of unease. The man had aged well, with a magnetic charm that seemed to draw everyone in. He was tall, with an easy smile and a charismatic energy that immediately put Robert on edge. But it wasn't just Rick's presence that bothered him. It was the way Rick focused all his attention on Lucy. Robert noticed how his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than was necessary, how he seemed to make extra effort to engage her in conversation. Lucy, for her part, appeared flattered, laughing a little too easily at Rick's jokes, enjoying the attention. At first, Robert tried to dismiss the feeling, telling himself it was all harmless. After all, they were just old friends catching up. But the more time passed, the more uncomfortable Robert became. Rick's attention was more than friendly, it was possessive in a way that Robert couldn't ignore. Lucy, though kind and polite, didn't seem to mind the attention at all. In fact, she seemed to bask in it. Robert couldn't help but feel like an outsider in his own marriage. What had seemed like an innocent gathering of old friends was beginning to feel like something else entirely. Little did he know, this was the first step toward a betrayal that would change everything. As the night wore on, Robert couldn't shake the growing discomfort in his chest. It wasn't just Rick's flirtatious comments, though they were becoming more frequent. It was the way Lucy responded to them. She was laughing a little too loudly at his jokes, touching his arm when she spoke, and looking at him in a way that was far more intimate than any casual conversation should be. Robert tried to ignore it, but the feeling of unease gnawed at him. Was this how it had always been between them? Was this some harmless flirtation, or was there something deeper at play? Lucy seemed oblivious to the tension Robert was feeling. She appeared to be having a great time, catching up with old friends, and enjoying the attention. Rick's gaze never left her, and with every passing moment, Robert's discomfort intensified. It wasn't jealousy, at least, not entirely. He trusted Lucy, or he had trusted her. But this was something new. The longer they spent time together, the more Robert began to notice the subtle shift in their dynamic. Rick wasn't just reconnecting with Lucy as an old friend, he was pushing boundaries. And Lucy, whether out of nostalgia or something else, wasn't stopping him. She was enjoying it, maybe too much. Robert caught glimpses of her body language, the way she leaned in a little closer, the way her eyes would soften when Rick spoke. Every touch, every laugh felt like a betrayal, even if it was happening in plain sight. Robert's mind raced. Was Lucy flirting with him? Was there something going on between them that he didn't know about? He couldn't fathom it. But with every passing moment, his stomach tightened with the horrible certainty that something had shifted, and it wasn't just the reunion. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Robert. He couldn't focus on anything but the feeling that was now impossible to ignore. The trust he had always relied on, the certainty he once had in his marriage, seemed to be slipping through his fingers. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing, consuming him with each passing second. It wasn't until they returned home from the reunion that everything came crashing down. Robert tried to act like everything was fine, but the weight of what had happened lingered between them, like an unspoken truth that was too heavy to ignore. Lucy was quieter than usual. She didn't have her usual energy, her usual spark. Robert sensed she was struggling with something, but he couldn't bring himself to ask. After all, what could she possibly say that would make him feel better? It was late one evening when Lucy finally broke. She had been sitting beside him in silence for what felt like hours when she turned to him, her face pale and her eyes filled with regret. Robert looked at her, confused, unsure of what was happening. And then, in the softest voice, she confessed. The words hit him like a tidal wave, knocking the air out of him. "I've been seeing someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to hear the rest. He couldn't. But Lucy kept talking, explaining how the affair had started weeks after the reunion, how she and Rick had rekindled their old friendship, and how, over time, it had turned into something more, something that was no longer about friendship at all. She told him everything: the dates, the secret meetings, the conversations they had shared, the moments they had spent together. Robert felt numb. He couldn't even bring himself to look at her as she spoke. The woman who had been his life, his partner for so many years, had betrayed him. She had given herself to someone else, someone he had trusted, someone who had stood beside them at their wedding years ago. All that time, all those years of trust were now tainted by the knowledge that his wife had crossed a line. It was hard to breathe, let alone process what she was saying. The weight of it all felt like 1,000 bricks on his chest. Lucy's voice cracked as she begged for his forgiveness. She explained that it hadn't meant anything, that it had been a mistake, but Robert couldn't hear it. He was drowning in the pain of the truth. How could he have been so blind? How could she have done this to him? For the first time in their marriage, Robert saw a stranger sitting before him. Lucy wasn't the woman he had known, the woman he had trusted. She was someone else now, someone he wasn't sure he could ever look at the same way again. The devastation was overwhelming, and as the words settled in, Robert realized that everything he had thought he knew about their life together was a lie. In the days following Lucy's confession, Robert's world seemed to tilt. He couldn't bear the thought of facing her, let alone speak to her about what had happened. She had shattered his trust, torn apart the foundation of their marriage, and all Robert could feel was an overwhelming, all-encompassing anger. Yet there was nothing he could say that would make this hurt any less. Words felt useless, like trying to fix a broken vase with superglue. So he did the only thing he could think to do: he stopped speaking to her. It wasn't an outburst of rage, but a quiet, suffocating silence. When Lucy tried to talk to him, he would leave the room. When she reached out to him for a hug, he would step away. Robert's heart felt frozen, as if the warmth he once felt for her had evaporated into thin air. The betrayal was too raw, too fresh, and the anger inside him made it impossible to connect with her anymore. Lucy seemed confused at first. She kept asking if they could talk, kept pleading for forgiveness, but Robert didn't respond. He wasn't ready to hear her words, nor did he think he ever would be. How could he trust her again? How could he ever look at her the same way after what she had done? In his silence, he was trying to protect himself from the immense pain that threatened to consume him. Every time she reached out, he was reminded of her betrayal, and each time he retreated further into himself. The house felt colder without their usual conversations. The laughter and easy camaraderie they had once shared were gone. The silence between them became a wall, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Robert knew he was hurting Lucy, but the weight of his own hurt made it impossible to care. He wasn't sure how to fix this. In fact, he wasn't sure he wanted to fix it. The life he had known was gone, and all that was left now was an empty shell of what had once been a loving home. Days turned into weeks, and the silence in the house grew louder. Robert couldn't bring himself to talk to Lucy, but the thought of divorce kept gnawing at him. The idea of ending their 30-year marriage was a difficult one to even entertain, yet it was becoming harder and harder to ignore. He had always believed in the sanctity of marriage, in working through problems together. But this wasn't a simple misunderstanding or a rough patch, this was betrayal. This was a lie that cut deeper than he had ever imagined. He found himself questioning everything about their relationship. Was their love real, or had it always been fragile? Had she been unhappy all these years? He began to replay the events of the past, every moment they had shared, every conversation they had, every argument they'd had, and tried to figure out where it had gone wrong. But it wasn't just about understanding what had led her to cheat. It was about the fact that she had chosen Rick over him, had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That image of her with Rick, the man who had been so eager to claim her at the reunion, kept replaying in his mind like a broken record. And it hurt more with each passing day. Robert wasn't sure how to proceed. The idea of divorce was terrifying. How would their children, Emily and Jack, take it? Would they be able to understand why their father had made this decision? He wasn't sure he could live in the same house as Lucy, but he also didn't want to tear apart the family they had built. Yet every time he looked at her, he was reminded of the betrayal, and he found himself further and further from the man he used to be. He didn't know if there was a way back, or if there even should be. But he couldn't live like this forever. The distance between them, the suffocating silence, the constant reminder of what she had done, he couldn't bear it. He started to consider what his life would look like without her, what it would mean to walk away from everything they had built together. As much as it terrified him, as much as the idea of divorce weighed on him, he knew he couldn't stay in a marriage that no longer felt real. The truth was, Robert was drowning in his own heartbreak. Divorce seemed like the only way out, but it also felt like the final nail in the coffin of the life he had known. After weeks of emotional turmoil, Robert finally reached his breaking point. The silent treatment had done little to heal the wound in his heart, but it had allowed him to process his anger, confusion, and sorrow. He could no longer avoid the inevitable. The day came when he couldn't stand the tension any longer. He needed answers, closure, or at least some form of resolution, no matter how painful it might be. Robert asked Lucy to sit down with him. The house felt unbearably quiet, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Lucy, who had been trying to engage with him all this time, sat down cautiously. Her eyes were filled with remorse. But there was something else there too, fear. She could sense that the moment had come, that Robert was no longer willing to pretend that things were okay. As they sat across from one another, Robert looked at her, his heart heavy with a mix of sorrow and rage. He had never thought he would have to confront her like this, his wife, his partner, the woman he had built a life with. He had always imagined that when their relationship went through tough times, they would work through it together. But now he was sitting across from a woman who had destroyed the trust that held everything together. "Why, Lucy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Lucy's face crumpled, and she broke down in tears. "I don't have a good excuse, Robert," she said, her voice shaky. "It wasn't about you. It was about me. About something I was missing in myself, and I made a terrible mistake." The words seemed hollow to Robert. He couldn't believe that this was the woman who had stood beside him through so much. How had it come to this? The betrayal hurt too much to hear excuses. But even as Lucy begged for forgiveness, Robert found himself unable to speak. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy with the weight of the truth. It was clear to him now no amount of apologies or regret would erase what had happened. She had crossed a line, and the damage was done. "You destroyed everything," Lucy Robert said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how I can ever look at you the same way again." In that moment, both of them realized something there was no going back. The damage was irreparable. The relationship that had once been filled with love and trust had been shattered beyond repair, and no amount of words could fix it. Robert stood up and walked away, his heart aching with the realization that his marriage was over. This wasn't the man he had hoped to be in the future. He had envisioned growing old with Lucy, not sitting across from her as a stranger, no longer able to find his way back to the life they once shared. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur. Robert couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the painful reality of his situation. The thought of divorce was now an unavoidable part of his life. He couldn't keep living in the same house, pretending that everything was fine when he knew it wasn't. The trust was gone, and with it, the foundation of his marriage. The decision to divorce was agonizing, but it became clearer with each passing day. Robert knew he couldn't remain in a relationship where he felt constantly betrayed and unloved. He had spent years building a life with Lucy, but now that life seemed like a hollow shell. He wasn't sure if he still loved her, or if what he felt now was simply the pain of what had been lost. But either way, they couldn't go on pretending everything was normal. Robert contacted his lawyer. The paperwork for divorce was filled out, and the reality of ending his marriage began to set in. He couldn't look at Lucy without seeing Rick's face, without remembering the way she had betrayed him. Even if she hadn't meant to hurt him, she had deeply. It was impossible to ignore. The hardest part was telling their children. Emily and Jack, who had grown up in a household filled with love, were now caught in the middle of their parents' broken relationship. Robert didn't know how to explain it to them. How could he possibly make them understand that their mother, the woman who had always been their rock, had betrayed everything they stood for? He didn't want to drag them into the mess of adult emotions, but he knew he had no choice. The day came when Robert sat Emily and Jack down to tell them. He did his best to explain in a way they could understand, but the pain in their eyes was too much to bear. They had questions, of course, but Robert didn't have answers. He didn't have any clear explanations. All he knew was that their mother had made a choice that had torn their family apart. As the divorce proceedings moved forward, Robert felt a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that he was finally taking control of his life, but grief for the life he had lost. He had spent years with Lucy, had dreamed of growing old together, but now all of that seemed so far away. The future felt uncertain, and Robert couldn't help but wonder if he would ever be able to trust again, if he would ever be able to open himself up to someone the way he had done with Lucy. But for now, all he could do was take it one day at a time, trying to rebuild his life from the wreckage of his past. And as the divorce papers were signed, Robert knew that it was the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of something new. He just didn't know what that was yet. After the divorce was finalized, Robert was left with a mix of relief and deep sadness. The house that had once been filled with the sounds of family life, laughter, arguments, casual chats was eerily quiet. His children, Emily and Jack, were with Lucy on alternating weekends, and while he loved them dearly, the absence of the daily chaos was overwhelming. Robert often found himself wandering the house, staring at objects that once held meaning, but now felt like distant memories of a life he no longer recognized. He realized that in his marriage to Lucy, he had lost himself somewhere along the way. For years, his life had been about her, about their family, about maintaining the picture-perfect home and career. But now, with the marriage over, Robert found himself staring into a future he hadn't planned for, one where his identity was no longer defined by his role as Lucy's husband or the father of their children. He was simply Robert now, a man in his late 50s, trying to rebuild from the wreckage. The first few months after the divorce were the hardest. Robert tried to focus on work, throw himself into his hobbies, and find new ways to spend his free time. He started taking long walks, something he hadn't done in years, and began reconnecting with old friends who had faded into the background over the years. He even enrolled in a photography class, a hobby he'd always been interested in, but had never had the time to explore. Slowly, he began to find small pieces of himself again, like a man who had been lost in the fog for too long and was now finding his way back to clarity. But the emotional scars from his marriage still lingered. Robert sometimes caught himself thinking about Lucy, about the good times they had shared, about the love they once had. He couldn't entirely erase those memories, but he had to accept that what they had was gone, and it would never return. In some ways, he had to mourn the loss of that version of himself, the man who had been in love with her. But the reality was that he couldn't keep holding on to a past that no longer existed. Over time, Robert learned to enjoy his own company again. He rediscovered the things that made him happy, the things that had been buried under the weight of his marriage. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the loneliness crept in. But he began to realize that his life wasn't defined by his marriage to Lucy, and he had the power to carve out a new path for himself. And then, one day, while attending a local art exhibit, he met someone new. Her name was Kate. She was a few years younger than him, with a warmth and sincerity that immediately drew Robert in. They started talking, and something clicked. For the first time in a long time, Robert found himself laughing again, enjoying someone's company without the weight of past hurt hanging over him. Kate was kind, thoughtful, and shared many of his interests. While he wasn't ready to jump into another relationship, it felt nice to be reminded that there was still the possibility of connection, of finding love again, even after everything he had been through. As the months turned into a year, Robert continued to rebuild his life. The pain of the divorce was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He had come to understand that the end of his marriage to Lucy didn't mean the end of his life. It was simply a new chapter. It was difficult at times to not fall into the trap of dwelling on what he had lost, but Robert learned to focus on the present, on the things he could control, and the things that made him happy. He became more involved in his photography, even started a small side business doing portraits for friends and family. The creative outlet gave him a sense of accomplishment, and it was something just for him. Lucy, for her part, seemed to be moving on as well. They had conversations about their children, and Robert could see that she was trying to rebuild her life too. He didn't harbor any ill will towards her anymore, though he couldn't say they were friends. They were two people who had once shared everything but now were only connected through their children. He wished her well, but he had learned to accept that their paths had diverged, perhaps forever. Robert started to think about the future with a sense of cautious optimism. He wasn't sure if he would ever find someone to build a life with again, but for the first time in a long while, he was open to the possibility. He had learned a lot about himself through the pain, about his capacity for growth, and about what truly mattered in life. And so, Robert took it one day at a time. He focused on his health, his work, and the people who cared about him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he no longer feared it. He had walked through the storm of heartbreak and betrayal, and although it had changed him, it had also made him stronger. The future was his to create now. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope this story resonated with you. Don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.